Let's be honest for a moment. If you have less than $100,000 saved right now, there's a feeling you can't fully ignore. It's not panic. It's not even fear in the obvious sense. It's quieter than that. You're getting by. You're paying your bills. You're handling your responsibilities. On the surface, everything looks stable, but underneath, there's something else. A subtle awareness that things are not as secure as they should be, and that thought doesn't show up when you're busy. It shows up when everything gets quiet, when you stop moving for a moment, and you're left alone with where you are. You've worked, you've stayed consistent, you've tried to be responsible. So naturally, a question begins to form. How did things end up here? Not in a bad place, but not in a strong one either. Somewhere in between. And that in between is where most people live. Stable enough to continue, but not secure enough to feel in control. It's a position that feels acceptable until you start thinking about the future. Because this isn't really about the number. It's about what the number represents. It reflects years of decisions, years of habits, years of beliefs about money that were formed long before you ever earned your first dollar. You were taught to work hard, to save what you can, to avoid unnecessary risk. And those ideas sound responsible. They create discipline. They help you stay steady. But here's the part most people never question. They don't always create growth. They keep you stable, but they don't always move you forward. So you keep doing what feels right. You keep working. You keep repeating the same patterns, believing that eventually something will change. But over time, something becomes clear. Effort alone is not enough. Because money does not respond to effort the way you were taught. It responds to how you think about it, how you position yourself around it, how you make decisions that allow it to grow beyond your time. And if no one ever showed you that, it's possible to spend years doing the right things and still not get the results you expected. That realization is uncomfortable because it forces you to look at things differently, to question habits that once felt safe, to admit that what you've been doing might not lead where you want to go. And that's exactly why most people avoid it. They stay with what feels familiar. They delay the deeper questions. They tell themselves they'll figure it out later. And without realizing it, they stay on the same path, hoping for a different outcome. But here's where everything can change. Because the moment you stop avoiding your position, and you see it clearly, honestly, without excuses, you gain something most people never reach: clarity. And clarity gives you power. Not to panic, not to rush, but to finally make different decisions, because time is going to move either way. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the difference will not come from how hard you worked. It will come from whether you changed how you think, whether you shifted your approach, whether you chose to act differently. Most people won't. They'll hear this, feel something for a moment, and then go back to what's comfortable. But a few will recognize something deeper, that this is not just information, it's a turning point. A moment to stop, reassess, and take control of something that's been on autopilot for too long. Because where you are right now is not the problem. It's the signal. There is a condition in which many people find themselves, not through sudden failure, but through gradual progression. It is not a state of collapse, nor one of immediate danger. It is something far more subtle. A position where everything appears to function as it should, yet nothing truly advances. A person works, earns, pays expenses, and maintains responsibilities. From the outside, there is no visible problem. Life continues. Obligations are met. Stability is preserved. And because nothing is visibly broken, nothing is questioned. But beneath that surface, there is a quiet awareness. It does not arrive as fear or urgency. It appears in still moments, when activity pauses and the mind begins to reflect. A question forms not forcefully, but persistently. Whether the current path is leading somewhere stronger or simply maintaining what already exists, many choose not to follow that question. They return to routine, because routine provides comfort. It gives a sense of control. It allows a person to feel productive, even when progress is not being made. If I were beginning again, I would not confuse activity with advancement, because movement alone does not create growth. A person can remain active for years, even decades, and still find that their position has not changed in any meaningful way. Not because they lacked effort, but because their effort was never aligned with a clear direction. There is a distinction that must be made here. Stability is not the same as progress. Stability maintains what exists. It prevents decline. It creates order. But progress expands. It builds. It strengthens. It moves beyond the current position. Many people believe that because they are stable, they are progressing. They assume that time, combined with effort, will eventually produce results. But time does not create growth by itself. It magnifies patterns. If the pattern is limited, time will only repeat that limitation. And so, a person may continue for years, believing they are moving forward, when in reality, they are remaining in place. This is how financial drift begins, not through one decision, but through many small ones. Choices made without deliberate thought, actions repeated without examination. Each decision appears reasonable in isolation. There is no single moment that feels significant, but over time, they accumulate, and their combined effect determines the outcome. A person may choose convenience over adjustment, comfort over reflection, familiarity over change, and because these choices do not produce immediate consequences, they are rarely questioned, but they shape direction quietly, gradually, consistently, until one day the result becomes visible not as failure, but as stagnation. If I were beginning again, I would examine these patterns early, because what is repeated becomes permanent, and what becomes permanent begins to define your future. There are many who remain in this condition for years. They are capable, they are disciplined, they are consistent, yet their position does not expand. Not because they cannot move forward, but because they have never paused long enough to question whether their actions are leading anywhere different. There is a moment, however, when awareness begins. It does not come from external pressure. It comes from internal recognition, a realization that what has been accepted as normal may not be enough. That maintaining a position is not the same as improving it. That continuing the same pattern will not produce a different result. This realization is uncomfortable because it challenges everything that felt safe. It forces a person to admit that effort alone has not been sufficient, that something has been missing not in how hard they worked, but in how they directed that effort. Most people avoid this moment. They return to what feels familiar. They delay change because it feels easier, and over time, that delay becomes permanent. But a few respond differently. A few see this moment for what it is, not a problem, but a signal that something must change, not just in what they do, but in how they think, in how they approach money, in how they make decisions, in how they define progress. If I were beginning again, I would take that signal seriously, because awareness, once recognized, cannot be ignored without consequence. It creates a point of decision, continue as before, or change direction. This is where drift ends, and direction begins. There is also another layer to this condition that must be understood. The patterns that shape your financial life did not begin when you started earning. They began much earlier, long before your first paycheck, long before your first financial decision. Ideas about money are formed gradually, through observation, through instruction, through repeated exposure. A person grows up hearing how money is spoken about, whether it is scarce or abundant, whether it is something to fear or something to use, whether it is to be protected or directed. These ideas are not always explained clearly, but they are absorbed, and over time, they become belief. That belief operates quietly. It influences decisions without being noticed. It determines how a person reacts to opportunity, to risk, to saving, to spending. And because it feels natural, it is rarely questioned. Many are taught discipline, to work hard, to avoid loss, to preserve what they earn. And these principles are valuable. They create structure, they create order, but they do not always create growth. They teach maintenance but not multiplication. And this is where limitation begins. A person who has been taught only to protect money will hesitate to use it differently. They will avoid risk not because it is unnecessary, but because it feels unsafe. They will preserve what they have but struggle to expand beyond it. And so, they remain within a pattern that keeps them stable but limits their movement. If I were beginning again, I would question these beliefs, not to reject them entirely, but to expand them, to understand not just how to protect money, but how to direct it. Because there is a difference. Protection preserves. Direction multiplies. And without direction, effort remains limited to what it can produce directly. There are many who have worked for years, increased their income, improved their skill, and still find themselves in the same position. Because income alone does not create strength. It creates opportunity. What matters is what happens after. If money is not directed, it does not grow. It moves. It circulates. It disappears through habit, obligation, and immediate need. And the cycle continues: earn, spend, repeat. This cycle creates stability, but not advancement. If I were beginning again, I would break that cycle. Not by earning more, but by thinking differently about what I earn, by assigning purpose to it, by deciding where it goes and why. Because the moment money is given direction, everything begins to change. Having understood that stability without direction leads to stagnation, the next principle becomes essential. It is not enough to recognize the pattern. A man must understand how to change it, because awareness alone, without action, produces no result. And action, if not directed correctly, will simply repeat the same outcome in a different form. If I were beginning again, I would not attempt to do more of what I have already done. I would change the way I think about what I do. There is a common belief that increasing effort will eventually produce a different result. A man works harder, takes on more responsibility, seeks to earn more, believing that this increase will create advancement. And to a degree, it does. Income may rise. Opportunities may expand. But without a change in direction, the outcome remains limited. Because effort, when applied within the same pattern, produces the same pattern. It may grow slightly, but it does not transform. If I were beginning again, I would recognize that there is a limit to what effort alone can achieve. Time is finite. Energy is limited. And no matter how much a man works, there is a point beyond which his output cannot increase significantly. This is not a failure. It is a natural boundary. And beyond that boundary, something else must be introduced. That element is direction. Direction changes the nature of effort. It allows each action to build upon the last. It ensures that energy is not wasted, but accumulated. It creates a path where results begin to grow beyond what a man can produce directly. If I were beginning again, I would not ask how much more I can do. I would ask how what I do can produce more than itself. This is where most people remain limited. They exchange time for income, believing that this exchange will eventually create security. But the exchange remains constant. Time is given. Money is received. And when time is no longer given, the exchange stops. If I were beginning again, I would not rely solely on this exchange. I would introduce a second form of movement, one that continues beyond my direct effort. There is also the misunderstanding that this requires large amounts to begin. Many believe that without significant capital, nothing can be done. But this is not accurate. Direction begins with intention, not amount. A man may have little, yet if he directs it consistently, it begins to grow. And as it grows, its ability to produce increases. If I were beginning again, I would begin with what I have, not wait for what I do not. There is also the importance of consistency in this process. A single action taken once produces a limited result. But repeated action, applied with the same direction, creates accumulation. And accumulation leads to growth. This growth is often slow at first. It may appear insignificant. And because of that, many abandon it too early. If I were beginning again, I would not measure progress too soon. I would allow the process to continue. There is also a shift in thinking that must occur. A man must move from asking, "How do I earn?" to asking, "How do I build?" Because earning is temporary. It depends on continuous effort. Building creates something that continues beyond that effort. If I were beginning again, I would focus on building, because building creates leverage. Leverage is the ability to produce more without increasing effort proportionally. It allows results to grow while effort remains constant. It may take many forms, systems, knowledge, capital, but its purpose is the same. It extends the effect of what a man does. If I were beginning again, I would seek to understand leverage early, because without it, progress remains limited to personal capacity. There is also the challenge of patience. A man who has been conditioned to expect immediate results may struggle with processes that take time. He may begin, act for a short period, and then stop when results are not visible. This interrupts the process. It prevents accumulation, and it resets progress. If I were beginning again, I would remain consistent beyond the point where results are visible, because that is where growth begins to accelerate. There is also the danger of distraction. A man may begin to understand direction, yet divide his attention among many paths. He pursues multiple opportunities, changes focus frequently, and in doing so, weakens his progress. If I were beginning again, I would concentrate my effort. I would select a direction and remain with it long enough for it to produce result, because divided effort produces divided outcome. There is also the strengthening of identity that follows consistent action. A man who directs his effort begins to see himself differently. He no longer identifies as someone who maintains. He becomes someone who builds. This identity influences every decision. It removes hesitation. It strengthens commitment. If I were beginning again, I would build this identity through action, not intention. There is also the gradual nature of change. A man does not transform instantly. He adjusts, he refines, he improves step by step. And over time, these adjustments create a different result. If I were beginning again, I would not seek sudden change. I would seek continuous improvement, because continuous improvement, when maintained, leads to transformation. There is also the importance of awareness throughout this process. A man must observe his actions, his decisions, his patterns. He must recognize what contributes to his direction and what does not. If I were beginning again, I would develop this awareness deliberately, because awareness allows correction, and correction maintains progress. There is also the removal of fear related to change. A man who has remained within stability may hesitate to act differently. He may fear loss, uncertainty, or failure. But these fears are often the result of unfamiliarity, not actual danger. If I were beginning again, I would not allow fear to prevent movement. I would act with understanding, because what is understood can be directed. There is also the compounding effect of correct action. Each decision, each step, each adjustment adds to what has already been built. Over time, this creates growth that appears to accelerate. What once felt slow becomes faster. What once felt small becomes significant. If I were beginning again, I would trust this process, because it does not require perfection. It requires consistency. There is also the final realization. A man's financial position is not determined solely by how much he earns, but by how he directs what he earns. Effort creates opportunity. Direction creates result. If I were to express this as instruction, I would say this: do not rely on effort alone. Direct it. Fix this firmly within your mind. I do not only earn, I build. I do not only maintain, I expand. Because once this principle is applied, the pattern changes. And when the pattern changes, the outcome must change with it. At that point, the question is no longer whether you are behind. The question becomes how far you are willing to go from where you stand now. And that answer is determined not by your past, but by the direction you choose to follow from this moment forward. In the end, the number itself is not the problem. It never was. What matters is what the number reveals. It reflects patterns. It reflects decisions. It reflects how money has been understood, used, and directed over time. And once you see that clearly, the focus shifts. You stop asking how you ended up here and begin asking what must change from this point forward, because where you are now is not a final position. It is a starting point. Many people never reach that realization. They stay focused on the surface. They compare themselves to others. They measure what they have against what they think they should have. And in doing so, they remain distracted from what actually matters. Direction. Because without direction, nothing changes. A person can continue working, earning, maintaining, and years can pass without meaningful progress. Not because they lack discipline, but because their effort is not aligned with growth. It is aligned with repetition. And repetition without change produces the same result. Again and again. But the moment direction is introduced, something shifts. Not immediately in results, but in movement. Decisions become deliberate. Actions become intentional. Money is no longer something that simply passes through your hands. It becomes something you position, something you guide, something you assign purpose to. And that changes everything. Because once money has direction, it no longer depends entirely on your time. It begins to extend beyond it. It begins to build, slowly at first, almost invisibly. And this is where most people make a mistake. They expect change to happen quickly. They look for immediate proof. And when it doesn't appear, they question the process. They hesitate. They stop. But growth does not work that way. It builds quietly. It accumulates. It strengthens beneath the surface before it becomes visible. And if you interrupt that process, you reset it. If you remain with it, you accelerate it. That is the difference. There are those who continue, and there are those who restart. Those who continue begin to see change, not suddenly, but steadily. What once felt small begins to expand. What once seemed insignificant begins to matter. And over time, the gap between effort and result begins to close. To someone on the outside, it may appear sudden. It may look like a breakthrough, but in reality, it is the result of consistency applied over time with direction. That is what most people never experience. Not because it is unavailable, but because they do not remain long enough. So the question is not whether you are behind. It is whether you are willing to change how you move forward. Because everything you need is already in front of you. Time is still moving. Opportunity is still present. And your ability to act has not been removed. What matters now is how you use it. If I were to express this as a principle, it would be this. Do not measure your position by what you have accumulated so far. Measure it by how you choose to direct what comes next. Fix this firmly within your mind. I do not move without purpose. I do not repeat without awareness. I do not allow what I have done before to limit what I can build now. Because once this becomes your standard, everything changes. You stop drifting. You stop reacting. You begin to lead your own direction. And when that happens, your results can no longer remain the same. Not because of luck, not because of circumstance, but because you chose to think differently, act differently, and build differently from this moment forward.